The sun has left and forgotten me.
Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. The stories you share can build and nurture the connections you crave, and it's simpler than you might think. I'm preparing for my opportunity to speak on a TEDx stage in the fall, and that's the theme of my talk, that our stories can be the conduit to reconnect us with our communities, beyond polarization, fear, and anger. To hold somebody's story like that and be responsible for it is a huge undertaking. You can't minimize that. That was a quote from Lee Keylock in episode 252. He's the director of global programs at Narrative 4, a nonprofit using their signature story exchange programs to guide students toward acceptance and empathy, two critical factors in reducing division and violence around the world. In this episode, he shares a few examples of these story exchanges, like the one when they brought a group of students from a small town in Kentucky to meet with students in the Bronx in New York City. And if you check out the Narrative 4 website, the link is in the show notes at elkinsconsulting.com, you'll see not only their stories, but the evidence that this kind of program changes lives in powerful, positive ways. Our conversation was published November 1st, 2022, and couldn't be more relevant today. I invite you to listen to this episode. You may not be convinced that your personal stories are important to share at work and at home, that your stories are too much about you. Maybe you don't like talking about yourself, and sharing your personal stories feel like you're doing just that. But maybe this episode will help you understand that your personal stories are what connect you to the people around you, making you more relatable and approachable, a more inspiring leader, and a better friend. Enjoy. There are so many guests that I've had on this podcast that just light me up, and this is absolutely no exception. My friend Lee Keylock is on the call today, and I'm eager to get started into this conversation. Our listeners will be interested in so much of what we have to talk about here. Along those conversations around storytelling, authenticity, and how we deal with trauma using stories. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Lee, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I'm happy to be here. And I don't know who you were describing in that intro, but I'll take it.
Yes, the signature humility over here. Well, Lee, let's start with the question that I love to ask my guests as we get started is, I'd love for you to share something about yourself that most people might not know about you, not in your LinkedIn profile or your bio. And just as an explanation for those listeners who haven't been following for the last 200 and some episodes, I love to ask this question because it gives a little insight into the person beyond what we're going to talk about. And it often leads right in full circle into what we want to talk about with the topic. So what do you think?
Well, I listened to some of your other podcasts, which are great. And I know that you posed that question, but then I got thinking, I'm like, oh no, what do I sort of come up with? And I honestly, a couple of things that people don't know. Well, anyone that knows me really well knows that I used to work in a nightclub years ago. I used to in New York City for about 9 years. And it was a pretty sort of crazy place. As you can imagine, I was a kid from England coming out, but I got to meet a lot of cool people in there, a lot of celebs and stuff. And I actually got to couple of things. I actually got to dance the can with Liza Minnelli on stage one night at the end of work. She was hopped up on stage and I'm like, I'm hopping up too. So we ended up starting this whole can thing at the end of the night. It was like 4 a.m. So that was pretty fun. And the other thing is I actually got friendly with Daniel Day-Lewis, who used to come in the club, the actor. And he was, we used to go at the same gym around the corner from this club. And he's a boxer too. I don't know if people know that about him. He used to sort of train as a boxer. So I used to go in and spar with him a little bit in this gym that we used to work in when he was training for the film The Boxer. And he asked me through this trainer. We used to have this trainer called Frank. And he asked me if I would go to LA with him when they were filming the movie. I think it was LA. and train with him during the movie. And of course I said no, because I had a job and a life and an apartment. So I actually said no to him. And he was
crazy.
Yeah, he was kind of fine. And so who knows how that would have turned out if I'd have gone there. Maybe it'd have been the next movie star with him. Who knows? I doubt it. But that was, so yeah, lots of little things like that. Not many people know that. There you have
Oh
it.
my gosh, that's so much fun. I love that. I have to ask, did you regret not going with him? Did you even ask him what he would pay so that you could
No,
take a leave from your job? No, you just
no,
said,
none
no,
of
I
that.
don't think so.
No, none of that. It was what was funny is when years later my wife, who is an actress, I was telling her this story and she's like, "Well, you got to blah, blah, blah," and we were in a post office in New York. He used to live off Gramercy Park, which is where we used to live in that area. And I bumped into him in a post office once. So he started rapping with me. And my wife was sort of mouth agape in this post office. But no, I have no regrets whatsoever. And she has regrets, and she wasn't even part of the story at the time. So she's like, "You could have done it for me." I'm like, "The future me." So yeah, but no regrets. Life is sliding doors, right? It's like I have it's meant to be what's meant to be. So
Totally agree. I love that attitude. I think about that a lot because I think of a conversation I had with this older woman years ago, and then we lost her suddenly. She was one of the healthiest 70-year-olds I've ever met, and she just died. And it was so shocking to all of us who knew her. MC Beebe was her name, and I just like to say her name to keep her memory alive. So MC Beebe, she was talking to me one time right after I left my job, my full-time job, to become completely self-employed. I've always had a side hustle, but this was like a big step, of course. And I said, "I'm just bummed that it took me this long to find what I'm really good at, that I can have real impact and still make income." And she said, "Sir, you had to go through all of what you went through to get to this point. You couldn't have done it earlier, and you wouldn't have had the insights or the ability to guide people without having had your own struggles and experiences. So you are exactly where you are supposed to be."
for sure.
And I kind of knew that, but hearing this 70-year-old fabulous woman, like just smart and funny and active, and she had just won a tennis tournament in partners tennis. And to hear her say that just was so encouraging. And she's right. So I love that you have that same kind of mentality about it.
Yeah, it's like every experience you had, right, is leads you to where you're at, right? And you can't, if you took any one of those out the equation, I don't think about this ad nauseum or anything, but if you take any one of those experiences or stories or songs out of the equation, it changes. Something has to change, right? So it would change the trajectory of where you are now, which is this place that you love, right? So yeah, she's right.
Exactly. Yeah, I miss her. So coming back to our guides and the people who say something that changes everything for us. When we had our first conversation on the phone, you mentioned an author that changed your trajectory. And I would love to hear the story, if you don't mind sharing that, about how you met this author and what ended up happening with that.
Yeah. It was actually an author, to be honest, that I didn't know much about, or never. I actually hadn't heard of Colin McCann. He's an Irish writer who lives in New York now, and I didn't know. And I was an English teacher for years, and I still am to a degree, right? You can't really sort of take it out of your system.
No.
But I met him. I met Colin after I was teaching in Newtown in Sandy Hook, right? And if most people, when they hear the name of that town, they sort of can recall the mass shooting that happened in our community. It's going to be 10 years in this December when that happened, and 26 people were killed in sort of under 4 minutes. I worked in the high school, which is just up the street from the elementary school, but a lot of my friends, and colleagues obviously worked in the elementary school. So as part of the sort of healing that I wanted, or the hope that I wanted to sort of instill back into my classroom with the students and think about how we heal, somebody handed me Colin's book, and it was called Let the Great World Spin. and it was a book. And this was actually in December. Our school shut down. The murders happened a couple of weeks before Christmas, and or 10, 11 days before Christmas. And somebody handed me that book, and I actually read it. I don't know, I just picked it up and started reading it, and it really spoke to me because it was a novel that very much underscored this idea of hope that's really hard fought, and sort of action, feet on the ground action sort of oriented. It wasn't cliche. And so many of the narratives after, I mean, I didn't know, this is what I learned, but so many narratives after a traumatic event like that is there's sort of, people will say prayers. Well, yes, we like prayers, but prayers aren't going to help people move from A to B sometimes, in their life, when you need pragmatic, sort of tangible stuff to help you get through trauma. So this was something that I thought could work. So I reached out to him, and I asked him if I could have 3 copies of his book. So
because you're an English teacher and no budget.
Plus first of all, the curriculum of any school is, thankfully in the last few years, there's been a sort of revolution around the curriculums and what we try and teach our kids. But it was also tragic, right? I think I was telling you in a previous chat that somebody wrote a book called Readercide. And it's how we commit readercide on our youth, right? By giving them all these tragic things to read all the time, or things they can't find themselves in all the time, right? And I'm not discounting the classics, but it can't all just be classics, right? We have to sort of contemporize our thinking. Mm-hmm. So this was one book that I thought could help. So his publisher, I reached out to his publisher. A friend of mine knew his publisher actually in the school, and he wrote me back within like 48 hours. I got a response from him, and then he made a visit up to the school, and we chatted, and he chatted with some of the students who were reading the book at the time. And the rest is history. 10 years later, sort of, this idea I know you're probably going to get to my work, but the idea that this book, right, sort of the story that this book, it was a polyphonic book. There were many tragic elements in the book, or sort of tragic characters, but there are these scenes in the book that are just gorgeous. And it's sort of like you aim, even if there's a crack in the wall or a crack in a window where a tiny bit of light is coming in, you head for that. Like if you can head for that and be optimistic about that, you don't, a candle, right? A candle, if you light a candle in a dark room, it's going to light the whole room pretty much. So it doesn't have to be this epic thing. And I just wanted that for the kids in my classroom, myself too, and the teachers in the school, whoever wanted to read it. I wanted people to read it. And he came, we chatted, and then this sort of whole story exchange thing, at least in my life, started that trajectory of how we use stories to heal, and stories as currency for connection and reconnection to yourself as well.
I love that. Partly because of something else you said in our previous conversation, which was that all of the adults were telling the high school students not to talk about the tragedy, but not to stop them from processing, but to stop them from maybe talking to media who were going to exploit whatever story they could about a sibling or the murderer himself that went to that high school. And so all of the adults were saying, don't talk about it. And they started to internalize it and not talk about it even when they needed to adults that they trusted. And that was a huge part to me, because so many times our identity is wrapped up in a tragedy that we experienced, even if we weren't the direct person experiencing it. So I'm thinking about all of these second and third victims of those murders, people who seem unrelated, a student at the high school that didn't know the shooter and didn't necessarily know any of those children, the kindergartners or the teachers that were murdered. They are still a victim. And this experience is part of their identity, as being part of, as soon as they say the word Sandy Hook or Newtown, people associate it with that experience. So for you to take that and say, I know that even if you weren't directly related, you still have this story that is narrating in your head, that unless we start to explore it and shift it so that your identity isn't tied to it in such a negative way, they're going to suffer for their whole lives with that knowledge, that part of their identity. So that said, tell me about the first time you did the story exchange and what that looked like. And then I think our listeners will kind of infer what you do.
Yeah. So the organization that I help run is called Narrative 4, the number 4, and you can go online and sort of Google it. But the premise is where it started simply, it's an artist founded organization, right? And we wanted to connect people through the use of story and how, sort of what is the highest aim of storytelling. At least the bunch of authors that got together in Colorado with Colin McCann and Lisa Consiglio. This was even pre-me. It was a few months before I met Colin. They had sort of dreamed up this notion, how best to use stories, right? How can we use stories to really impact and give people agency on the ground, as opposed to sort of this somewhat passive act, right? Of some, like, all the way people relate to books is a passive act, or any type of story. So the premise is quite simple. I mean, it's a sort of acting trick, really, right? It's like you take on the persona of somebody else. So if you, Sarah, and I were partnered, I would tell you a story from my life, and you would listen just to understand. You wouldn't listen to respond. You're not responding. You're just listening, deep listening, right? And then I could ask you questions at the end just to clarify certain things, but I'm not asking you questions about meaning. I'm just asking you questions, maybe to catch some of the essence, like, of the story. What was that name? What year? What month was that again? What country? I don't know, whatever it is. And then you would do the same. I would tell you a story and vice versa. But then we have to retell. We go back to a story circle and retell in the first person one another. So I become you. I literally say, hi, my name is Sarah. I am in Missoula right now, in Montana. And I think it's in Montana. There goes my English geography in America. But that's what I'd say. And I actually embody your story. And there's something transformative that happens when you do that, right? The distance is absolutely collapsed when you take on the first person of somebody, in this respect, with permission, with consent. Everybody's there through invitation to do this. Nobody's robbing stories or stealing stories, right? You have permission. Right. So, and it's an incredibly powerful thing to witness and to experience, that sort of intimacy between two people, which then becomes sort of 10 people in the story exchange circle. And you hear this cornucopia of stories, right? And there's no hierarchy of stories. Like, it could be a simple story, what we perceive maybe as a simple story of, I don't know, maybe a sports triumph, whatever. And then some people will go to some of their most painful moments, right? And I just remember that in Newtown, when I did this I was teaching juniors at the time, that the first class that I did it with, I didn't want stories of, well, it's not that I didn't ban any stories, but I didn't want them to tell necessarily stories about that day, right? The day, 12/14. So I encourage them to sort of think of other stories from their life, because we don't want to singly be defined by a single narrative, right? Or the danger of a single sort of story. And they started telling stories about, the usual things, right? First kisses gone wrong, or crazy grandpas at a Thanksgiving table, or, a time, actually, some of the kids would tell times they slept in a car and they were homeless for a couple of days, like things I never even knew like existed in their past, right? And all of a sudden we sort of, and it was cathartic. And I remember one girl, I won't mention her name, but she wrote in a journal afterwards, because I always have them reflect afterwards, but she told a pretty harrowing story that involved a suicide and things like that. And she said she's never been able to tell that story, and people have an opinion about this narrative that's attached to her. She couldn't sort of rewrite the record of her own story in public because she couldn't get through it emotionally. But the young man that she told the story to did retell that story, and it gave her a new sense of life, that finally this truth had been told by this other kid in her persona. Like, it was the most sort of amazing moment. And anyway, that's sort of how it went. And then we connected, and then we connected kids from Newtown High School to Crane High School in Chicago, north end of Chicago, and these kids deal with sort of gun violence on a daily basis. So there was a sort of natural bridge, not that we wanted to focus on that at all, and we didn't, but that's sort of how it manifests. So then we brought two completely different demographics together, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial background. We brought all of this sort of together in this space. And what happened was these kids just walked towards each other and found out they had so much in common, regardless of, the optics of how they look or how they dress or whatever. And they actually hung out after the story exchange way longer than the story exchange. So we knew we were onto something. We knew we had this thing. If you really, I mean, it's like James Baldwin says, right? It's much harder to hate somebody close up. If you meet somebody and you learn something intimately about them, you cannot dismiss them as much. And the person telling is also seen and validated. So it became this whole, we didn't even realize what we had in this little method of ours, so until we sort of did it. So.
Well, there were multiple times as you were sharing that I had those chills that come up my spine and all the hairs go up in the back of my neck. And that is always a phenomenal indication for me, not only of the impact of the work you're doing, but the way you are telling the story. I think sometimes we as storytellers forget the impact of the stories we're telling about other people on the perception of us. So as I'm listening to your story, I have this whole different view of you as a human being because of the way that you're telling somebody else's story.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I love about those interactions. And I'm very privileged. I get to bear witness to a lot of these stories that get told. And many times it's the first time that people are telling these stories. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard, well, I've never told this to anyone, as a lead-in to a story. And that's when people trust the process enough, or they feel safe enough to tell those stories. And that is the greatest gift of all, right? To hold somebody's story like that and be responsible for it is a huge undertaking. There's nothing, you can't minimize that, right? So there's a lot of prep work that goes. We don't just throw people together and say, okay, we're going to do this. There's some prep work, and you want to sort of create a space of where people can act very courageously, right? So it's awesome. People should try it. They should sign up and try one. We run them every week online too.
Well, definitely. I definitely want to participate in that. And if not as a participant, as an observer, because this is why I do what I do. This is why my podcast has 250 plus episodes, is because I hold that so close. That's such an honor that people share these stories. And you're right. It is a matter of creating that environment of trust and courage. And I think what I love about the way that you're sharing these stories is that I know just from hearing your perception of them in your presence, a calming safety.
Thank you.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's campfire stuff, really. I mean, if we could rewind all the way back to these incredible cave painters and stuff, right? That used to scrawl on the walls. They used to crawl through these, caverns, right? And there's a great poem. It's actually called The Cave Painters, Irish poet. I can't think of his name now. But essentially, these people wrapped this cloth or something around these rudimentary torches and lit them, right? And went into these caves and they painted on these caves. And I mean, that's the first story. Like, some of these are the first stories being told, right? Or being shared, or they're leaving some mark for somebody to sort of relate to. And, whether it's just knowledge dissemination or whatever, or just this desire to be seen, right? Even beyond your years, right? When we're no longer here. Like your friend that you were talking about at the beginning of this show, right? That sort of legacy is really important. So I think stories, we have this natural tendency to want to tell stories. We just have to provide the forum and the place for people to come together and do that. And I think we need more of it in the world, not less of it, you know?
Agreed. Agreed. I was just thinking about the power of sharing someone else's story, and the exponential growth that we can experience as a result of that. At the last keynote I did, I had people try to remember a time where they were mentored or had a boss or somebody in a position of authority that they had an experience where they were just overwhelmingly inspired by them, or that they just felt inspired to do their own thing as a result of a conversation with somebody that was in a position of authority. And then I had them share them with the person next to them. So I gave them a couple minutes each to share, to swap stories. And then I asked for volunteers and permission for people to share the story of the person that they heard. So from their, just like what you're doing with these story exchanges, having them talk about the story, not necessarily first person, but just to tell the story. And I remember this moment. It was one of those, oh, yes, this is what I love. I'm here for a reason. One woman shared a story that the other woman told her. And I said, okay, to the audience, what words would you use to describe this boss that she just told the story about? What words, what phrases would you use? And from the audience, a leader, compassionate, inspiring, ambitious, these really great words, powerful words to describe this person. And I said, how many of you know that person? And only the woman who originally told the story raised her hand out of a sea of 300 faces.
Wow.
And I said, wow, those are pretty big words to use for somebody you've never met. Now, how many of you know the woman who originally told the story? And I got her name, and maybe a dozen hands went up. And I said, okay, so very few of you know this woman. What words would you use to describe her, having told this story about her boss?
Yeah.
And the words were beautiful, again, compassionate, empathetic, kind, really the legacy words you want people to use to describe you. And I said, now think about that for a second. You have these amazing words for people you've never met because of a story told by someone you've never met. Now think about the impact of that and how your reputation, your ability to be an ambassador for your people grows as a result of simply sharing that story.
Mm.
Because the teller, the way that the person tells it, speaks volumes about the person themselves as much as it does about the person they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I witness that all the time, thankfully, which is why I say it's a great privilege to see that, in action. It's amazing what is housed in a 5-minute story,
Yes.
When you really unpack a 5-minute or a 3-minute story, you can unpack that. And it is like, it's like an umbilical cord between people, right? It's like this life-giving thing, right? You know so much about the other individual. You can at least infer so much, right? And that's just one story. Imagine if you had 10 from the person. It's exponential.
It is. And it includes so many other characters in that story that then develop living, breathing reputations.
Yeah, and it shatters it also. I think about group mentality, right? I think about that. This is a single moment between a few people or 300 people in your space, right, that you're talking about. But then I think about social media, and I think about, and that's overwhelming, right? When you've got thousands or millions of followers and they can buy into these sort of single destructive narratives about people or groups or whatever, right? You can pick your poison and it becomes an echo chamber. And yet one story can dismantle an entire theory you have about people or a
stereotype.
A stereotype. One story can dismantle that. And I've seen that happen. We do a lot of work in the Middle East. We've done a ton of work in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, some pretty beautiful but sort of hard places, right? Given the history of some of these places. And it can all get undone in a second. And that's what you have to build from. Somebody told me in the West Bank when I was there that some of the best, I think it was Column actually met the person that said this, but that some of the best buildings can be built out of rubble, the rubble of like, how do you keep going? Like, and that's the truth, that you can dismantle things and rebuild better, revision something from a single note or a single story, right? I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the story of music is you only have so many notes.
Yeah.
You
Sure.
deconstruct a song and rebuild it, and it's a completely different thing. It's not necessarily better, but it's definitely different, and sometimes better.
Right.
Wow. So when you think about the time when you started with this work, with this organization, Narrative 4, and you think about a moment, I can kind of see you already have kind of an image in your head when you realize that this was it for you, because you've done so many different things. And I would encourage our listeners to check out some of what you've done through your website and through your LinkedIn profile. But you've done so many different things, and this is sticky. This is 10 years with this organization, and you are still completely enamored with the work you're doing. So what was a time that you realized, okay, this is it. I am in exactly the place I am meant to be?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're perpetual students, right? I've never approached anything I've ever done as an authority on anything. I've seen 1,000. I don't know. I could go over 1,000 sort of every day. I could probably rewind to every day in the last 2 years and think of a moment. I'm like, yep, this is where I need to be. Yep, this is it. But I think we're about to. We run a program called a field exchange. It's really an empathy into action program, because a big part of our work is how do you, it's not enough to just hear stories. That can be brilliant and beautiful and life-changing. Yes, you can have those moments, right? But when we work with youth, we want them to think about how they can use stories to, think about themselves, their communities, and the world, and how their place in it, and how they can become agents of change, right? And so we have this sort of civic engagement program where stories, if you don't attach any action steps after a while to all these stories, it could just become voyeurism or whatever after a while, right? And so we bring these schools together. We're about to have, actually in a week's time, we're bringing a bunch of students from Eastern Kentucky, from the mountains of Kentucky, right? This sort of area that has, had a very beautiful history, but a very complicated history with coal mining and, a host of things. And as soon as you hear Kentucky, especially in the Northeast, people could just attach a ton of stereotypes to that. And we're bringing these kids over to the South Bronx in New York, right, to hang out for a week with kids in University Heights High School. So this is a school in Highland, in Langley, Kentucky, and we're bringing them to University Heights. So these kids are arriving, and they spend a week together, and we do all of this story work, and we sort of expose them to all these sort of amazing thinkers, these artists, these visionaries, these people engaged in their communities very deeply. And then we keep them connected for 3 or 4 months afterwards, and they come up with their own civic engagement project between these two regions that never sort of would meet unless we can become the conduit for that, right? And I remember this one kid, this was this was just pre-pandemic, because we haven't done it the last 2 years, obviously, because of travel. And this kid, Ezzeddine, he was a kid from Yemen, a young kid from Yemen, lovely, lovely kid, who just graduated. Actually, he's now at college in New York. And we brought the students over to, actually, this was online, this part. We got them to connect with a bunch of poets on Roosevelt Island called the Open Doors Reality Poets. And this is a group of individuals and people that live at Kola Hospital. And they are mostly sort of quadriplegic or paraplegic, or they've had extreme spinal injuries, right? And a lot of them through disease, but many of them through living in pretty rough areas where gun violence, and they've got clipped with with bullets, and they've ended up in wheelchairs, right? So this is a community that not many people know about. We bring these communities together. And this kid, Ezzy, was so moved by their stories, because just before we even told stories, some of the guys, we couldn't meet them until sort of after in the afternoon, because a lot of them don't get moved out of their beds until 11 or 12. And these kids, a couple of these kids showed up late a couple of times or whatever to Zoom. And then they suddenly realized the ordeal that some of these people had to go through just to show up on a Zoom, right? Get lifted from a bed into a chair, into a Zoom to engage. So it sort of rewired a lot of these students' brains. And then they really got engaged, and they came up with this civic engagement. It's amazing to me that this happened. And this kid thought, wow, one of the problems is that the blood flow for people in wheelchairs, and I'm saying this poorly, right? I'm paraphrasing terribly, but it needs help, right? Because they lay in a position for so long, or sit in a position for so long. So he went back to his school and he told his physics teacher, who ran this robotics club, didn't tell any of us at Narrative 4. This is just something he did, right? And he went back and he said, I want to design clothing for these people that will help move the blood flow. They'll send electrical current around. Anyway, so they did it, and they took it to this. And I found out like a couple of months later that they entered into this national competition for robotics. They didn't win, but they came pretty damn close. And this was all because this one young man, Ezzeddine, right, related so profoundly to some of the stories that were being told by the people at Cola. And now we have an incredible, and he's still pursuing it. This is not over. Just because he didn't win, his class didn't win some competition, they're still pursuing it. And one of the people that saw his design worked for Disney. And I can't remember who were the dream people at Disney. I can't think of their names now. That begins with an I anyway. But they got wind of it, and he was so moved that they're going to try and even fund this kid's project. This is an 18-year-old kid now, right? So that's the power of story. Like you can't sort of curate for that, right? That is something that just comes up and becomes inspiring and passionate, and you put passion together with an idea, and who knows what can happen. So those moments happen all the time, and I'm privy to that, and that's what I love, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about a young man that I interviewed on my podcast a few years ago that was inspired to go into medicine, to become a doctor, because of his experience watching his mother go through chemo for breast cancer. Mm. And that one interaction inspired him to become a doctor. And this kid from Yemen had not experienced anything directly from his family that inspired him to do this. It was through a story of meeting a stranger.
Right.
And that's just so powerful.
Yeah. And it's the kid I'm talking about too is like, he saw a poster on a wall in the school for Narrative 4, right? Because they're a school that runs story exchanges all the time. And it said something about empathy, and his sister, and he'll tell this story. His sister's like, "You're the most unempathetic person I ever known. You don't even care about anyone." So he joined just to see what it was like, and to see if he could like figure out this empathy thing that his sister had accused him of not having. So it was a beautiful story all the way around. It was just like this sort of each moment, right? Sort of inspired the next. Yeah.
As that is always the case, isn't it? I mean, it's always the case. And we just have to pay attention to those moments. And what I love about the storytelling aspect of this is that we do uncover those moments that would otherwise be lost. And when we uncover those, we inspire others to uncover their own pivotal moments and look back at that trajectory. How did that even happen? Because if we can share those stories, other people will start to see them and see them in their own lives, and maybe shift their narrative. Again, back to this whole, when you uncover the story that has the light, as you said, the one candle in a dark room, it can change an entire identity of somebody and how they've seen themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wish there was more room for that in some of our sort of climate that exists today, right? Not just in the US, but everywhere. You
Oh,
know?
there's room for it.
Yeah,
Question.
there's room, but people
Are we
have to
going to?
make room. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. There's plenty of room for it. But it has to be intentional. And you're making a dent in that with your organization. And I'm so grateful for our introduction. That I can't remember who introduced us. Do you remember who that was?
I think it was Margaret Larea, who's our director of learning resources. Somehow there
That's
was a
right.
connection.
It was through Jeff Eichler.
Yeah.
So
That's
Jeff
right.
Eichler used to work for the company that Margaret works for.
Yeah.
And she said, you need to meet this guy. And then after he met you, he said, Sarah, you need to meet this guy.
Yeah. Well, that was very nice of them, and they're right. And I'm glad our paths crossed. That's for sure. We're in the same lane, heading in the right direction, right? Trying to create a more kinder world.
Absolutely. And I think when I think about my ultimate goal in all the work that I do with StrengthsFinder and storytelling, the keynotes, the book, the podcast, it's really all about encouraging self-reflection and having people better understand how they're being perceived and being more intentional about how they want to be perceived. And you have to have consistent behavior that demonstrates what you want people to know about you. And so it all comes back to self-reflection and the way you're telling stories, because it's not the things that happen to you that define you and your identity. It's how you talk about them.
Yeah. I always remember something I listened to Ruby Sales say, the civil rights leader, who's probably in her 80s right now. But she said that the sort of catalyst for her to get into, social work and sort of engaged with people was when she met a young girl when she was in her 20s. And it was a sort of throwaway question. She asked the kid sort of, where does it hurt? And all of this floodgate of things came out of this young girl based on her life. It was a simple question. So it's the invitation, right? That's really crucial. And not just the invitation, because if you ask a question like that and then you suddenly pick up your cell phone and look at it while they're telling you, then that's awful. I mean, you have to listen, and you have to listen to understand instead of respond, right? You just have to listen. You don't even have to respond. And that's the beauty of some of this work too, is it teaches us how to be present and not distracted by 1,000 things when somebody is telling you something, because inevitably they will if you ask and give them space to do that.
Which takes me right back to the first story you told about the young woman who shared the story that she said, I'd never shared that before, and hearing her story partner tell it back from first person was that release for her. Because he listened.
He was so scared. I'll never forget that kid. He was so scared. And he actually came to me, because sometimes we will have the kids in class, we'll have them pair share first, right? And then we give them the night. At least I have that luxury when I was teaching, because I would see the kids sort of 4 times a week. So I would give them the evening to think about their partner's story and sort of reflect on it before they retold it the next day. And the kid came to see me the next morning. He says, I don't think I can tell this story, Mr. Keylock. I can't do it. Like, I don't have the skills to hold. I don't even know. Like, however he said it, he was very nervous. So I asked the young lady if it was okay, and would she be generous if he sort of messed it up. I was trying to give him ways in and ways, and she said, no, I chose you. She's like, I wanted you. I sort of headed to you and they didn't even know each other before that. She just had a sense about him. Right. And just afterwards, when he told it, and I'm sure he was shattered, like emotionally, he was sort of burned out, and probably the rest of the day was a bit of a blur for him. I don't know, maybe I'm projecting, but
no,
yeah, you just know, like, and I remember, I don't know, I've never followed up with him post school, but I wonder what he's thinking about that moment, or if he does think about it, I don't know. But that was probably a very powerful moment for him, when he realized, I too have agency, and sometimes you have to step out your comfort zone and find some comfort in the discomfort, right? In order to do something that could change your life as well as somebody else's. The reflective part, I hope he's reflected on that. I always think about it. So.
Well, what just struck me is that she said, I chose you.
She did, yeah.
Because of all the things that boy could have heard, I think those words, my eyes are tearing up, and that's really unusual for me. But she used those words, and he had to own them at that point.
There was no,
amazing.
I felt bad for him. There was no going back.
No getting out of it now. I
mean, how do you, he intuited that, right? He intuited that. And she did. They didn't speak in class. They weren't friends. She just had a sense about this kid that he was a nice kid, you know, and that somehow he would hold her story and tell it in a way that was graceful or something. I don't know what she was thinking, but she made a beeline for him. She got him.
Even as young as that, like, I don't know that I was self-aware enough to know how I was being perceived. Certainly not in my teens and 20s. I definitely wasn't. And he just got a glimpse of his future in terms of how he was perceived, the energy that he shared with the people around him, whether he knew it or not. And that's...
I should look him up.
Yes, please do. And then if you follow up, let me know, and I'll add it to the show notes for the podcast.
Yeah, I do. I will. Maybe I will. I'll try.
That would be awesome. And again, I mean, if they're willing to share their names, I really believe in sharing names to keep those legacies alive, to remember people for the beauty that they brought to our lives and now to our listeners' lives. Lee, if people want to learn more about you and learn more about what you do, where do they go?
Well, I mean, it's not me they're learning about. It's about the work that we engage in, right? It's
right.
Yeah, they go to narrative4.com, right? And we have this beautiful digital platform that we just launched. It was a soft launch about a month ago. And we encourage people to sort of take a look at the work that we're up to. We're in thousands of schools across the globe, right? And not only are we in those schools, we then connect those schools. So there's inter-school exchanges happening. And the idea is to just create this mass of youth that tells stories to one another. And there's always teachers at the helm, right? There's these great mentors that sort of help the kids to sort of develop the program in their school, and then it just takes on a life of its own. So you just go to our website. You can, depending on your region, you can click on a link and it will send you to the right person to chat with. But the whole point is really just to move from story to embody the sort of artist spirit as well, right? The artists, we have an expansive artist network across the world, and we try and get those artists into schools. There's many ways to tell a story, right? It's not just oral narrative, right? You can do it through music, dance, through illustration, whatever it is. And the other thing is then we sort of provide these very cutting edge learning resources for teachers to engage with. So it's like you sort of rewrite or flip the script on some of these classic texts as well as all these contemporary texts we have. So, but everything comes back to how do you use story as a catalyst for things you want to change within yourself or your community. So yeah, it's a pretty beautiful concept. And we're 10 years old, so we must be doing something right.
Absolutely.
We started on a shoestring budget. So here we are, thanks to some, angel investors and foundations that support our work.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, for our listeners, don't worry. We will have links in the show notes for this podcast episode. And they'll be at elkinsconsulting.com. And I'd encourage you to look up narrative4.com and engage on that website just to learn more about what they do and maybe get involved. Find a way to involve your student in one of these programs.
Yeah,
Lee, thank you.
No sitting on the sidelines, right? You got to get in there and at least be a participant first and start there, and then think about how you can also help sort of spread this joy,
Even if it's just at home listening to your own kid tell a story.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Lee, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time, your energy, and of course, your stories.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great. And this won't be the last, right? We'll stay in touch for sure.
Absolutely.
You must keep on trying. Smile what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.